Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world of trimmed hedges, polished marble, and statues with very questionable expressions. You're standing in the moonlight, just outside a Roman villa, where the scent of lavender and crushed mint clings to the air like forgotten perfume. A breeze rustles through cypress trees. Somewhere nearby, water trickles from a fountain shaped like a baby Hercules strangling a snake. And as you walk along the peristyle path, something small and smug is watching you from beneath the rose bush. It's not a gnome, but it could be. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from, and what time it is over there. Drop that in the comments if you're awake enough. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk past a marble bust of someone's great uncle, mounted on a pedestal that's just a little too short to be respectful. Along the garden's edge, peering out from between carefully clipped hedges, are a handful of ancient statues. Some are clearly gods, Zeus, maybe Apollo, but others are more ambiguous. A stocky little figure with a mischievous grin leans against a sundial. He has a wineskin bare feet, and a beard that looks like it was carved by someone with too much time and not enough taste. These statues aren't quite what you call gnomes, at least not in the fishing rod and pointy hat way. But to Roman senators, they were delightful little additions to their private spaces, objects that whispered taste, education, and more than a little eccentricity. Historians still argue whether these garden figures were primarily decorative or if they held spiritual or symbolic meaning. But there's no question that the Roman elite absolutely loved putting small, odd statues in their gardens. You pause by a mosaic bench, imagining a toga-clad aristocrat reclining here centuries ago, sipping wine and gesturing toward one of these little figures with smug satisfaction. Yes, he might say, swirling his Falernian vintage. That's a rustic satyr with thyrsus, carved in imitation of a 5th century Greek original. Of course, it's probably not. But the important thing is he believes it is. And so, do his dinner guests, because nobody wants to be the one who admits they don't know what a thyrsus is. The Romans inherited their love of gardens from the Greeks, but turned it into something even more ambitious. Where a Greek garden might be modest, even philosophical, a Roman senator's garden was a curated landscape of myth, memory, and messaging. And messaging meant status. That smug little statue of a faun peeking from behind the hydrangeas? That's telling visitors. I've read Theocritus in the original Greek. Have you? It's the ancient version of owning a shelf full of unread leather-bound books, or downloading Duolingo but never opening it. And yet, there's charm in it, too. These figures added whimsy to the otherwise rigid world of Roman life. The empire was full of order, aqueducts, taxes, marching legions. But in the garden, a man could surround himself with naked satyrs, tiny Herculeses, and half-goat flute players, because apparently nothing says republican virtue like mythical creatures with questionable pants. One statue near the colonnade shows a dwarf figure carrying a bunch of grapes, smiling widely, with bulging eyes and exaggerated features. He's likely modeled after a performer or entertainer, part of a now-lost troupe of mimes or jesters. Or perhaps he represents a foreign god, imported along with spices and scandalous fashion trends from the East. Fringe scholars even suggest these odd little figures served as household guardians, wards against bad luck, evil spirits, or nosy neighbors. A superstitious senator might believe that placing a strange, grinning satyr in his garden would scare off envious glances or gossiping slaves. And really, who wouldn't feel at least mildly unsettled being stared down by a 1-foot-tall pan flute enthusiast with marble abs? You take a seat beside a low basin where fish once swam lazily, surrounded by lotus and papyrus. In the moonlight, the shadows of the statues lengthen. You could almost imagine them moving slightly, adjusting their poses after centuries of stillness. That one near the fountain? He looks like he just winked at you. Don't worry, though. The only thing that statue guards now is dust. The tradition of small garden figures which stretch forward into the Renaissance and beyond, mutating through Baroque absurdity and Victorian kitsch, eventually spawning the modern garden gnome, complete with red cap, bulbous nose, and passive-aggressive smile. But we're still a long way from that. For now, you sit in the quiet dark of a Roman night, listening to the hush of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. A senator's garden is a strange place, both serene and slightly ridiculous, full of high-minded symbolism and lowbrow humor carved into stone. Just try not to trip over the miniature statue of Dionysus, riding a panther. He's been waiting here for 2,000 years to make someone laugh. You wander deeper into garden now, feet brushing against the gravel paths laid with obsessive symmetry. Even the plants feel like they're trying too hard. Topiaries clipped into shapes that may or may not be triumphal eagles, flower beds arranged like imperial crests, and that one hedge that definitely looks like someone's mother-in-law. But it's the statues that do most of the talking here. Not with words, of course, with toes. See, in Roman times, statuary wasn't just about who could carve the most realistic beard or drape a toga in the wind. It was a full-blown, high-stakes status game. And garden statues? Those were the flex of all flexes. Picture this. You're a Roman senator. You've got a villa, a seat in the curia, and maybe a suspiciously large number of gifts from grateful provinces. But what really shows the world you've made it? Not your marble floors or imported peacocks. It's that you can afford an entire grove of tiny, tastefully obscure deities no one else recognizes. These little guys aren't just decorations. They're evidence. Proof that you read obscure philosophers. That you visited Alexandria, or at least paid someone who did. That you can afford not only to buy the statue, but to hire a guide to explain what it's supposed to mean when guests come over. Historians still argue whether senators genuinely cared about the symbolism of these figures, or if it was all just one giant ornamental arms race. But either way, the results were unmistakably bizarre. Take, for example, the statue of Priapus. He was the Roman god of fertility, gardens, and, well, let's say he was very enthusiastic about growth. Some estates feature Priapus standing proudly near the vegetable beds, armed with a club and a grin that probably shouldn't be allowed near the basil. And while modern garden gnomes might hold lanterns or rakes, Priapus held something else entirely. Why put something so risque in your backyard? Because for the Roman elite, shock value and subtle symbolism often went hand in hand. If guests laughed nervously at the sight, you could always chuckle and say, "Ah yes, a protector of abundance and rural prosperity." Quite traditional. Then sip your wine as they squirm. Even more common were figures like fauns and satyrs, half-human, half-goat companions of Bacchus who loved wine, music, and causing just enough chaos to keep dinner parties interesting. These weren't high Olympian gods with thunderbolts and heroics. They were minor mythological weirdos. And that's exactly why they worked. They showed that you were worldly, whimsical, and not taking yourself too seriously. Unless you were, in which case you could always claim it was about evoking the Hellenistic pastoral ideal. Remember, Romans were all about appearances. Their gardens were open-air theaters of sophistication. And what better way to signal that than a statue of a draped muse playing a lyre, positioned just so that she looks pensive in the moonlight, even though you bought her last month from a dealer in Ostia who definitely forged the inscription. And it wasn't just about individual taste. It was also about placement. A senator might spend days deciding whether his statue of Apollo should be nestled beside the reflecting pool or move closer to the vine-covered pergola. This wasn't just landscaping. It was curation. Think Pinterest board, but with actual stone and centuries of cultural baggage. One particularly eccentric senator, whose name is lost but whose villa layout survives in maddeningly detailed archaeological records, apparently arranged his garden with increasing levels of intellectual challenge. The outer ring featured familiar figures, Venus, Mercury, a lion or two. But as you moved inward, the statues became more obscure, a laughing Silenus, a baby Minerva, even a strange, tiny god with three faces whose identity remains a scally mystery. The theory? Only the most educated guests would get the innermost jokes, which is the ancient Roman equivalent of password protecting your favorite memes. There's even evidence that some statues were commissioned to look like the owners themselves, just tweaked enough to pass as a heroic ancestor or minor deity. Imagine installing a statue that was technically Hermes, but somehow bore a strong resemblance to your own noble chin. Coincidence? Of course not. Just good lighting. Fringe theory suggests this also allowed for a certain immortality. By inserting yourself into the garden pantheon, You weren't just making a fashion statement. You were sneaking into myth. A stone version of you, forever lounging near the fish pond, might outlast even your grandest marble tomb. Of course, not everyone bought into the statue craze. There were Roman writers, usually grumpy stoics or sarcastic satirists, who mocked their peers for turning gardens into museums of marble nonsense. A forest of stone and none of it wise. One line goes, though scholars still debate whether that was a genuine insult or just ancient trolling. Still, as you stroll past another statue, this one possibly depicting a goddess, though it's missing its arms and possibly its head, you feel the pull of the idea. Each statue tells a story, even if the story is, the owner had too much money and not enough hobbies. You pass a vine-covered trellis where a small, hunched figure crouches beneath a fig tree. He's barely a foot tall, rounded belly, stubby fingers, and an expression of intense concentration. What is he doing? No one knows. Maybe he's thinking. Maybe he's guarding the figs. Maybe he just needed a moment. That's the charm of these figures. They invite interpretation. Are they gods, jokes, guardians, or all three? You'll never know for sure. But as the wind rustles the leaves and the shadows of these statues dance in the lamplight, you realize something important. Wealth may come and go, politics may rise and fall, but the urge to decorate your garden with tiny, mysterious figures? That, apparently, is eternal. You pause at a fork in the garden path. Two directions, equally inviting. One curves toward the sound of a fountain. The other leads under a stone arch where ivy curls like lazy handwriting. The air smells of warm earth and old rosemary. You take the path toward the water, your sandals, or maybe slippers, scuffing softly over the gravel. And as you do, you start thinking about how this whole obsession with statues didn't begin with senators. It started with farmers. Not the kind of farmers with estates and Latin poetry collections, but the gritty, mud under the fingernails kind. Long before marble gods started photobombing grape arbors, Roman peasants were honoring the spirits of the land with offerings, shrines, and yes, tiny figurines. Back then, you didn't need a toga or philosophy degree to want a little help with your crops. You just needed a field and the constant anxiety that it might not rain again until next October. Enter the rustic guardian spirits, genii loci, or spirits of place. These weren't Olympian celebrities. They were humble, local entities who looked after specific homes, trees, or corners of a field. Historians still argue whether these spirits were thought to be actual supernatural beings, or just poetic traditions that grew legs, sometimes literal ones, over time. Either way, people honored them with little statues, clay dolls, or carved wooden figures. You'd set one near a well or on a fence post, and maybe whisper a few kind words as you passed. And here's the best part. These rustic guardians often had gnome-like qualities. They were small, protective, slightly mischievous, and fond of good company. They weren't pointy-hatted pranksters, but they weren't stiff deities with lightning bolts either. They were relatable, like having a low-key supernatural buddy who just wanted your beans to grow and your goat to stay put. Eventually, as Rome expanded and became less about subsistence farming and more about lounging in mosaic tile courtyards, the humble guardians of the countryside got an upgrade. Wealthy Romans didn't want muddy little figures carved from old fence posts. They wanted art, Greek-style art that said, I am both spiritually aware and incredibly tasteful. So those early field spirits were slowly rebranded. They became bronze satyrs, marble nymphs, or stylized household gods. You couldn't just place a crude doll next to your decorative olive tree anymore. You had to commission a craftsman to sculpt a vineyard sprite with emotional depth in its eyes. You approach the fountain now, and there it is, an old, slightly mossy figure pouring water from a jug. His nose is chipped, his toes are worn, and he's been leaking for about 1,800 years. But you can still tell he's not a god, not exactly. He's a helper, maybe even a symbol of the garden itself. Always pouring, always giving, always slightly overworked. That's when you realize these statues weren't just art. They were metaphors. Visual shorthand for what a garden meant. Abundance, fertility, peace. And because Roman religion was deeply tied to daily life, even the act of placing a small figure near a vineyard was part spiritual insurance, part humble brag. Look, it said, I respect tradition. Also, I'm rich enough to sculpt tradition in white marble. Fringe scholars like to point out that some of these statues were probably recycled spirits, taken from older pagan customs and dressed up in the newer clothes of Roman myth. That grinning little satyr beside the olive tree, he might have started out as an Etruscan field demon or a Sabine orchard ghost. Now, he's got a pan flute and a Greek name. Cultural assimilation, Roman style. And you can't ignore the fountains. Roman gardens loved a good trickle. And what better to anchor a water feature than a mythological figure awkwardly holding an urn? These statues were often designed with running water in mind, their open mouths or tilted jugs turning mythology into plumbing. You haven't lived until you've seen Neptune eternally spitting into a shallow pool, because some architect thought it would impress the neighbors. There's something oddly comforting about it, though. These figures, once rural and spiritual, now became part of the engineered piece of a Roman garden. The trickle of water, the scent of citrus, the echo of sandals on stone, all of it framed by figures meant to quietly bless your leisure time. You settle on a low bench shaped like a lion with a missing paw. Across from you, two small figures perch beside a fig tree. One is clearly Pan, goat legs, pipes, and a smirk that screams, "I know what you did last Saturnalia." The other is harder to place. She's small, cloaked, maybe even a child. Some believe these were versions of the Lauras, protective household spirits who evolved from the same countryside guardians. Others think they were just convenient decorations that could be passed off as religiously significant if the tax collector asked too many questions. It's easy to see how these figures eventually became, well, gnome-like, small, protective, slightly ridiculous. They're not heroes or emperors. They're supporting cast. Background characters who nonetheless make the whole scene come alive. And while we're here, can we talk about the eyes? Roman statues, especially the older ones, often had eyes that were painted or inlaid. That means these weren't blank stares. These guys looked at you. Imagine wandering into your garden at dusk and locking eyes with a 2-foot-tall stone figure who seems just a little too aware of your choice of sandals. Some theories suggest that these statues were even moved around periodically, placed in different parts of the garden depending on the season, or perhaps the mood of the homeowner. If that sounds suspiciously like modern gnome repositioning, well, maybe we're not so different from our marble-loving ancestors. So you sit there by the fountain, flanked by water-stained guardians and overachieving grapevines, and you realize this isn't just a garden. It's a narrative, a living or at least statuesque. Story told through gesture, myth, and moss. And like all good stories, it started simple, with a farmer and a field spirit, and grew into something a bit grander. The moonlight now brushes across the garden in silver streaks, catching on dew-slick leaves and turning even the most weathered statues into something almost divine. You meander past an olive press half swallowed by weeds, your hand grazing the cool marble of a nymph's outstretched arm. She stares into nothing, smiling faintly, as if remembering a joke that's been lost to time, which, come to think of it, might be the perfect description of Roman aristocratic humor. Because tonight, we're heading into the soft underbelly of Roman status anxiety, villa design. And oh, did those senators love their villas. These weren't just countryside getaways. They were palatial, Instagram before Instagram monuments to the one thing more important than military victories or senatorial debates, being more tastefully rich than the guy down the road. So, let's zoom out for a second. Imagine yourself walking to the front gates of a Roman villa. Not the city house where politics happened, but the rural estate where your money grew and your ego blossomed. The moment you enter, you're hit with a full sensory blast. The scent of bay laurel and crushed thyme, the sound of running water from hidden fountains, the crunch of gravel under your expensive sandals, and most importantly, the sight lines. Everything was placed to be seen. The gardens weren't designed for wandering aimlessly. They were designed to frame and direct the eye, to stage manage a parade of stone figures and curated views. Historians still argue whether this visual choreography was more influenced by Greek theatrical traditions or Etruscan ancestor worship. But either way, the message was clear. Behold the glory of someone who knows where to put a bench. And here's where it gets deliciously petty. Because those little statues, the fawns, the fertility spirits, even a scraggly old man who may or may not be Sylvanus with bad haircut. They weren't just spiritual or artistic choices. They were strategic. Every nook of the garden had a role to play. You'd put a statue of a reclining river god near the fish pond to hint at your dominion over nature, a bust of Homer near a reading alcove to say, "Yes, I do understand dactylic hexameter. Thank you for asking." And maybe a pair of giggling cupids near the vine-covered arbor for that extra pinch of flirtation, in case your evening stroll turned into an impromptu poetry reading/wine-fueled flirt fest. But not all villa owners were content with sticking to mythology. Some went full throttle weird. One archaeological site near Pompeii revealed a villa garden with a statue that appears to depict a goat wearing a toga, not metaphorically, literally. A goat's head on a human body, complete with senator's robes and an expression of deep existential regret. Was it satire? A tribute? A joke that only made sense after 2 amphorae of Falernian wine? Scholars are still baffled. And then there's the obsession with scenes. Roman villa gardens often featured so-called tableaus, little sculptural dioramas that capture a moment frozen in time. Think of them as ancient, silent Instagram reels. One garden might show a drunken Bacchus leaning on a startled maiden. Another might capture a group of satyrs chasing a terrified hare. These weren't just decorations. They were conversation starters, interpretive puzzles, invitations for guests to prove their education by referencing obscure mythological texts. You walk past one such tableau now. A wrinkled old man asleep under a tree, his dog curled at his feet, a basket of figs beside him. Sweet, right? Until you notice the tiny inscription at the base. Beware the sleeper who sees more with closed eyes. You're not sure what it means. Honestly, no one is. But if someone asks, you can just nod thoughtfully and say, it's a reference to Hesiod's lost works. Very esoteric. Some villa owners even added motion to their gardens. Not with animatronics. We're not that anachronistic. But with wind-powered chimes, water clocks, or sculpted fountains designed to spit in rhythmic arcs. And who better to anchor those moving features than tiny gods or grinning satyrs? It gave the illusion that the spirits were still alive, still watching, still mildly judging your outfit. And speaking of judging, don't forget about entrance gnomes. Not literal gnomes, mind you, but grotesques. These were small, exaggerated statues placed near doorways or garden gates, often with squash faces, twisted limbs, and frankly questionable anatomy. Some think they were meant to ward off evil spirits. Others believe they were just a way to prank guests. Oh, you didn't notice a guy with 3 noses standing next to the roses? How embarrassing for you. Fringe theories even suggest that some villa owners kept a rotating cast of these grotesques and minor deities, swapping them out for special events, birthdays, harvest festivals, dramatic reenactment of that time. They almost met Julius Caesar. Picture a team of servants carefully moving statues around like they're setting up for a theme park ride. Okay, Bacchus goes by the wine press. Cupid near the dessert table, and let's put the weird goat senator in storage this time. He made the last guest cry. And while we're here, let's talk about garden paths. They weren't just for walking. They were curated experience corridors, designed to reveal the garden and its statues in perfectly timed reveals. Walk 5 paces, and suddenly a bust of Minerva appears behind a vine-draped arch. Turn left at the sundial, and there's a grinning faun you didn't notice before, peeking from behind a cypress tree like he's got gossip. It's like a museum curated by someone with an eye for drama and a serious fondness for mystery. You begin to understand why Roman senators were so obsessed with these little figures. They weren't just pretty. They were players in an elaborate social theater. Every statue told your guests who you were, or at least who you wanted them to think you were. And through it all, you catch the distant echo of peacocks somewhere behind the hedge maze, the soft burble of water, the cool kiss of marble on your fingertips. In this garden, you are both audience and actor, and the tiny figures watching you, well, they've been here a long time. Longer than you, longer than empire. You follow the winding garden path deeper into the estate, your steps soft against the gravel as vines brush your sleeves and night-blooming jasmine leans in to whisper secrets. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird calls out, a sound that could be an owl or an ancient senator reminding you to trim your laurels. The statues continue to emerge in the moonlight like half-remembered dreams. And then you notice it. Something small, crouched beneath a fig tree, holding a bunch of grapes with mischievous intent. It's not a god. It's not even particularly elegant. It's almost silly. Wide-eyed, bearded, a belly like a loaf of fresh bread and a grin that says he knows all your secrets and won't tell a soul for a price. Meet Priapus. And no, he's not just here for decoration. Priapus was one of the weirder entries in the Roman garden pantheon. A minor god of fertility, gardens, and male virility, among other very unsleepy attributes. Priapus was often stationed at the edge of gardens to serve both as protector and, how shall we say, enthusiastic symbol of abundance. Mainstream history books usually tuck Priapus into a footnote, perhaps because his stature comes with a very prominent feature that makes him hard to ignore at family gatherings. But to Roman landowners, he wasn't just a naughty joke. He was a legitimate figure of rural worship, originally borrowed from Greek myth, and then thoroughly Romanized into the guardian of boundaries, orchards, and, well, private property. You see, Priapus didn't just stand around making guests blush. He had a job. His statues often bore inscriptions like, "This land is protected by Priapus. Thieves will be," and then something deeply unprintable would follow. Let's just say the punishments he threatened were tailored to his specific talents. Historians still argue whether Priapus was genuinely feared as a divine enforcer or mostly treated as garden slapstick, a kind of ancient scarecrow meets stand-up comic. Evidence exists for both. In some countryside homes, Priapus statues were garlanded with flowers and treated with real reverence. In others, he seems to have been a star of bawdy poetry and crude party jokes. There's even a fringe theory, quietly circulated among scholars who've had too much symposium wine, that some Romans believed Priapus could animate at night to patrol the gardens. Imagine that. A gnome-sized fertility god creeping around your grapevines after dark, chasing off burglars with terrifying determination and an awkward center of gravity. And it wasn't just about scaring thieves. Priapus, in his weird little way, represented something bigger. Literally and symbolically, he embodied plenty. Gardens weren't just for beauty. They were for food, pleasure, life. And Priapus was all about abundance, even if he delivered that message with the subtlety of a carnival barker. You pass one now, tucked into a niche between two pomegranate trees. He's a little worn. The years haven't been kind to his finer details, and moss has crept into places moss really shouldn't go. But he's still grinning, still clutching his grapes, still watching. The presence of Priapus statues even influenced Roman garden design. Since he was considered a boundary deity, he was usually placed near gates, fence lines, or at the end of paths, almost like a checkpoint. You've reached the edge of the cultivated world. Beyond this fig tree lies only wilderness, or worse, the neighbor's cat. And it wasn't just Priapus who filled this odd role of miniature enforcer. Other small, boundary-loving figures dotted Roman gardens. Some gods, some spirits, some just unnamed grotesques. Think of them as ancient equivalents of smile. You're on camera signs, except they were made of terracotta and had suspiciously intense eyebrows. There's something wonderfully contradictory about it. Roman senators, those paragons of dignity, discipline, and rhetoric, surrounding their villa gardens with tiny, rude statues who look like they belonged in a naughty pub crawl. But maybe that's exactly why they loved it. In the privacy of the garden, among trusted friends and bottles of overpoured wine, you could let down the philosophical mask, laugh a little, be just a touch obscene. It's no coincidence that so many surviving examples of Roman humor come from garden epigrams and inscriptions. The graffiti, the puns, the little rhymes carved at the base of statues. This was their safe space to be human, to admit that life was funny, fleeting, and occasionally ridiculous. Especially when you're trying to teach your house cat not to drink from the nymph's fountain again. One odd little statue you stumble upon now confirms this vibe perfectly. It's a squat, round-cheeked figure, perhaps a satyr, perhaps a rustic farmer, caught in the act of tripping over a root. The sculptor went to the trouble of carving the expression of surprise, the tilted foot, the rolling eyes. It's funny, intentionally funny, like a marble blooper reel. Fringe historians, Those wonderfully odd folks who write papers no one else reads, propose that some of these statues were based on real-life mishaps. A guest falls over a fountain, and next week, a statue appears in the garden immortalizing the moment. Petty? Absolutely. Delightful? Also yes. As you continue down the moonlit path, brushing past rosemary and low-hanging fruit, you begin to appreciate how these small figures formed a secret language among Roman elites. It wasn't just about piety or artistry. It was about community. In jokes, winks across the marble, a kind of soft rebellion against the formality of the Senate floor. You crouch beside one last Priapus, smaller than the others, hidden behind a hedge. Someone's etched a new smile onto his face, long after the statue was made. A child's prank, maybe, or a house slave amusing themselves between chores. Either way, the effect is the same. He seems more alive, less like a symbol and more like a companion. And that's the magic of these garden gnomes. Yes, we're calling them that now. They weren't just decorations. They were witnesses, guardians, the silent audience to generations of laughter, arguments, flirtations, and spilled wine. You stand, the scent of crushed time still clinging to your hands, and you smile back at Priapus. Because honestly, who wouldn't want a tiny, bearded statue watching over their tomato plants with that much chaotic energy? The air grows still as you step into the oldest part of the garden. Here, the statues stand closer together, their features more worn, their postures a little more rigid. Less playful fawn, more stoic grandparent who disapproves of your life choices. The trees loom taller, older, their gnarled trunks woven with ivy and memory. And in this hush, you begin to notice something curious. A pattern. All these figures, gods, nymphs, tiny grotesques, aren't just scattered randomly like a toddler flinging toy soldiers. They're arranged with precision, not just for symmetry, not just for vibes, but with meaning. Because this part of the garden isn't just pretty, it's philosophical. Welcome to the Hortus Conclusus, the contemplative garden. And if that name sounds unnecessarily dramatic, that's because it is. Roman senators didn't do anything halfway, especially not thinking. These elite gardens were more than status symbols. They were physical manifestations of worldview. You walk a path, and the statues you encounter aren't just decorative. They're cues in a moral lesson, a mini curriculum in stone. It's like if someone made a botanical version of a TED Talk, but with less clapping and more marble thighs. Take that statue over there, a weathered Socrates, half-shadowed beneath an arched arbor. He's holding a scroll in one hand, gesturing with the other, mid-thought, mid-sentence, forever on the brink of genius. Now walk 12 paces forward and turn slightly. There's a bust of Epicurus, smiling just enough to annoy Stoics everywhere. He's tucked between two laurel bushes. Coincidence? Absolutely not. Roman senators loved to perform philosophy. Not just quote it, perform it. And their gardens became stages where these performances could unfold. Historians still argue whether these layouts followed established garden schools of thought or more like choose-your-own-adventure ethics trails. But either way, each statue had a job: to provoke thought, to spark debate, or at the very least, to give a guest something profound to say after their fourth glass of wine. And just like that, we meet another class of ancient garden gnomes, the philosophical dwarfs, if you like. These were small busts or full-figure miniatures of famous thinkers, poets, and historical figures, placed strategically in outdoor study alcoves, benches, and fountains. You wouldn't just sip wine beneath a trellis. You'd sip wine beneath Plato's disappointed gaze, which honestly sounds like a modern podcast waiting to happen. Some villas even had full philosophy walks, pathways lined with curated series of thinkers, each meant to represent a different school or mood. Feeling melancholy? Stroll the Stoic path and pass Zeno, Seneca, and a suspiciously sad bust of Marcus Aurelius. Feeling indulgent? Veer toward the Epicurean lane, where statues smirk under grapevines and someone's carved "pleasure is a goal" into the base of a sundial. There's a statue to your right now, an old man seated, one leg folded, eyes gazing skyward. No nameplate remains, but the furrowed brow suggests deep thought or mild digestive distress. Either way, you get the sense that he's not here to decorate. He's here to contemplate. and to make you feel like you should probably be contemplating something, too. Of course, there are actual Roman philosophers who designed their gardens with philosophical purpose. Seneca the Younger is said to have spent long hours walking among his garden statues, delivering imaginary lectures to them. We all have coping mechanisms. Cicero, who loved his garden almost as much as he loved the sound of his own voice, once described how certain plantings and statuary encouraged a tranquility of the soul. Fringe theories suggest that some senators took this even further, embedding secret codes or alignments into their gardens. Picture it. Statues that align with the solstice, inscriptions whose meanings change depending on the viewer's direction, sculpted scenes that replay a myth in spatial form, a kind of slow-moving stone, novel you read with your feet. And nestled among these grand thinkers, you'd sometimes find odd little figures, a crooked old man labeled Fate and Fate, or a blindfolded child labeled Fortuna. These were reminders. Life is short, chance is fickle, and your prize-winning figs won't protect you from mortality. One particular garden in Baiae featured a delightful contradiction, a statue of death and a statue of Bacchus, placed mere steps apart. You'd walk from solemn skeletal reminder to drunken glee in under 10 seconds. Interpret that how you will, but the message seems pretty clear. Drink now, before the bone guy catches up. And if that doesn't make you smile, maybe this will. Some philosophical gardens included animal statues dressed as humans, a fox in a toga, a wise owl perched on a scroll. Satirical? Probably. Hilarious? Definitely. But also, maybe, a commentary on human folly. Or just someone's idea of a great conversation piece when the wine hits. You stop now beside a fountain shaped like a scroll. Its water's trickling slowly from carved Latin letters that read, "Truth is like water, clear until you stir it." You'd roll your eyes if it weren't so beautifully lit. The scent of rosemary hangs in the air, and the breeze ruffles the cypress fronds like a sigh. It's easy to see why senators love these spaces. Inside the Senate, everything was posturing, alliances, risk, but in the garden you could drift. You could muse. You could drink and debate whether virtue is innate or acquired, while pointing at a statue of Diogenes and asking, would you live in a barrel? And this love of philosophical statuary wasn't confined to the rich. Smaller versions of these garden figures have been found in middle-class homes. Less marble, more terracotta, but the sentiment was the same. Even if your garden was a cramped patio above a bakery, you could still place a bust of Socrates in the corner and call it your thinking spot. So you move slowly now, passing from bust to bust, pausing at each one to offer a small nod. You don't need to understand every ancient reference. You don't even need to agree with them. The statues are here to prompt a question, not answer it. And as the moonlight filters down to the branches, bathing the philosophers in silver, you feel it. The gentle tug of thought, the old Roman urge to wander both garden and mind. Your feet shuffle over worn cobblestones now. Smoother here, like generations of footsteps have rubbed them soft. The garden has shifted. You've passed the rows of moral philosophers and somber deities, and wandered into a much more theatrical place. At first, you think the statues are just expressive, a bit more dramatic. But then you spot one with a mask held to its face, half hidden behind a column, and the penny drops. You've entered performance wing of the garden. Yes, performance. As in comedy, tragedy, and that middle ground Romans love best, satirical chaos. This was the pergola scenica, a term whispered to the bougainvillea, which basically translates to backyard stage. Because if you think garden gnomes were weird, wait till you meet the Roman obsession with backyard theater. To understand this section of statuary, you need to picture Roman senators not just as lawmakers, but as curators of culture, and by culture, we mean drama. Romans adored their theater. Not always the kind with 3 acts and a moral at the end, but the kind with shouting, slapstick, mistaken identities, and just the right amount of someone losing their toga. So naturally, they brought this love home. Quite literally. Many wealthy villas included a mini-stage or an open-air theater nook where guests could perform, or be performed to amidst sculpted audiences. Statues of muses, actors, comic masks, and even mythological characters were positioned like eternal spectators or frozen cast members. You've never truly lived until you've been judged by a stone-faced muse of tragedy while reciting poetry after wine. Over there, see that tall figure with curls like cinnamon spirals? That's Melpomene, the muse of tragedy, holding her tragic mask in one hand and a sword in the other. She's flanked by Talia, the muse of comedy, who looks like she's been giggling for 2,000 years. Together, they stand watch over a small platform carved into the ground. Faint traces of wooden pegs suggest this was once used to erect a stage. Historians still argue whether these home performances were amateur passion projects or full-blown status events with hired troops, scripts, and audience seating. But inscriptions found near these areas often mention garden entertainments and private comedies, so it's safe to say the Romans did not see their flower beds as off-limits to drama. And this is where things get especially fun, because the statues themselves were sometimes actors. Not literally, of course, but Roman artisans would sculpt dynamic scenes of mythology in mid-action. Medea with dagger raised, Icarus tumbling from a pedestal, a Bacchante mid-spin with wine sloshing forever from a cup. These weren't just ornaments. They were visual performances. They brought the myth to life, made it part of your stroll, your mood, your evening, like if Netflix made lawn decor. And of course, no Roman performance zone would be complete without the garden equivalent of blooper reels, caricature statues. These little figures, exaggerated features, dramatic postures, were scattered near the theater zones. Some looked like drunken poets. Others like mocking impersonations of local officials. Fringe historians believe these may have been modeled on real people in the owner's social circle. Nothing like immortalizing your rival senator as a squinting, hunched statue with crossed eyes. You pass one now. A short figure with wide, startled eyes and an oversized scroll clutched like it's about to explode. The scroll reads important decree, but the statue is barefoot mid-stumble. It's possible you're looking at a satire of some actual bureaucrat who once tripped over his own authority. Romans loved this stuff. They didn't just mock the enemy. They mocked everyone, including themselves. Garden inscriptions from Pompeii mention things like, for noble Lucius, who fell off the stage twice but still believes he's Cicero, which is both savage and hilarious. And of course, the Roman love for masks, those classic theater masks of joy and sorrow, wasn't just symbolic. They were actual garden decor. You'd find terracotta faces nailed to walls, set above fountains, even hung like wind chimes under porticos. Some had water spouting from their mouths. Others just grinned into the void. The idea was to create an atmosphere of suspended performance, a feeling that anything could happen, even while trimming the hedges. There's a statue beside a vine-covered bench now. Two actors locked in a frozen embrace, one clearly faking injury, while the other appears to roll their eyes. You'd think it was a bad sitcom episode, but it's likely a tribute to Plautus, the master of Roman comedy. His plays were filled with mix-ups, disguises, and characters shouting by Jupiter while hiding in barrels. So yes, this is basically the ancient equivalent of a slapstick garden gnome, and senators loved it. In fact, they admired it enough to sponsor their own mini-plays. Some would write short comedic sketches, usually self-referential, full of inside jokes, and perform them during dinner parties right here, surrounded by these statues. One anecdote mentions a senator who cast himself as a humble gardener, forced to teach his guests how to identify sacred herbs, while completely failing to do so. His garden was full of smug, leafy gods afterward, but there was another layer, too, a slightly more serious one. These dramatic zones weren't just for comedy. They also serve as places to reflect on the tragic stories that define Roman identity. Statues of Aeneas carrying his father, or Dido with her final torch, reminded visitors that Rome's glory was built on both triumph and pain. You might laugh by the fig tree, sure, but by the fountain of Cassandra, you pause. You'd remember. And maybe that's what kept Roman gardens from becoming just overgrown playgrounds for the elite. They were curated experiences, places where you could move from satire to sorrow to sublime beauty in a few dozen steps. The garden wasn't just alive with plants. It was alive with feeling. You sit now on a bench shaped like a lyre, a statue of Calliope leaning beside you, scroll half unfurled. You imagine the whispers of forgotten lines, the breathless hush before a punchline, the applause of rustling leaves. And just like that, you realize in the Roman garden, everything performed, even silence. The scent of blooming roses drifts past you, mingling with a faint, sharp tang of crushed herbs underfoot as you wander into a quieter corner of the garden, where the statues are smaller, less grand, but no less significant. Here, the focus shifts from gods and philosophers to something more personal. The family. Roman senators cared deeply about their lineage, their reputation, and the legacy they would leave behind. Their gardens were not only public statements of wealth and taste, but private archives of memory. It was in these shaded nooks that you find the ancestors immortalized, not just in marble, but in spirit. You come across a cluster of busts, each worn by time, their faces softened but still proud. These are the imagined ancestral portraits that Roman families displayed with reverence. Unlike the gods or mythological figures, these busts depicted real people. The senator's grandfather, great-aunt, or even a beloved freedman who had earned respect. The imagines were more than mere decoration. They served as a daily reminder of duty, honor, and the burden of expectation. A senator walking past these faces would feel the weight of his ancestors' achievements and scandals alike, a kind of quiet pressure to maintain the family name. One particularly striking bust shows a man with a stern jaw and a faint, knowing smile. Historians still debate whether this likeness was idealized or true to life. Some argue that these portraits were sculpted not to capture reality, but to project virtues like wisdom, courage, or piety. Others believe they were attempts to preserve personality across centuries, a kind of ancient selfie for the elite. What's fascinating and a little quirky is that some imagines weren't perfect marble replicas, but included small, unexpected details. A faint scar here, a crooked nose there, or even a carved-in mole. It's as if the sculptor wanted to remind viewers that these weren't gods, but real people with flaws and stories. This touches on a larger debate among scholars. Did Roman families see their imagines as sacred relics, or were they more like social tools, used to impress guests and intimidate rivals? The answer is probably both. In a society obsessed with status and display, the imagines function as visual evidence of a family's long-standing prestige. Nearby, you find something even more intimate, a small statue of a child holding a tiny scroll. It's delicate, almost fragile, the innocence of youth captured in stone. Childhood was a precious and precarious time in ancient Rome, and memorializing children in the garden was a way to honor those lost too soon or to celebrate the hope of future generations. In some cases, these statues were personalized with inscriptions, perhaps a favorite poem or a family motto. They whispered stories of love, loss, and hope, set against the backdrop of blossoming flowers and the steady rhythm of garden fountains. There's also a charming tradition of placing small guardian figures near the children's statues, miniature versions of protective deities or household spirits intended to watch over the young. Some were modeled on the Lares and Penates, gods of the home and hearth, while others were more playful, resembling impish gnomes that kept watch from their perches. One unusual discovery from a Roman villa included a tiny terracotta figure holding a lantern, thought to symbolize a guide through life's uncertainties. This little beacon stood beside the statue of a young girl, lighting her path even after she was gone. The practice of ancestor veneration in gardens extended beyond statues, too. Some families planted specific trees or flowers in memory of loved ones, believing that nature itself could hold and express memory. The idea that a tree's growth mirrored the flourishing of a family's legacy was both poetic and practical. Walking through this part of the garden, you get a sense of time folding back on itself, the ancient and the living intertwined. These statues weren't just cold marble, but touchstones for memory, identity, and connection. And yet, even here, the Romans couldn't resist a little humor. Some imagines sported subtle caricatures, like exaggerated wrinkles or cheeky expressions, tiny rebellions against the seriousness of death and legacy, perhaps a reminder that even as they honor their ancestors, the living still had a life to enjoy. As you linger near a bust of a matron holding a scroll, you imagine the conversations that might have taken place in this garden corner. Whispered advice, gentle admonishments, laughter recalling old family tales. The garden becomes a living archive, where stone and story mingle. In a way, these familial garden statues serve the same purpose as today's family photos, heirlooms, or even social media posts. Markers of who we are, where we come from, and who we hope to become. The garden, in this light, is more than a place of beauty. It's a bridge between generations, a silent witness to the ongoing saga of family life, ambition, and love. You breathe deeply, savoring the mingled scent of earth and memory, and feel a quiet kinship with those long gone, whose faces watch over this sacred space. A gentle breeze stirs the leaves as you step away from the family bus and deeper into the garden's quieter, more mysterious zones. This part feels different, less polished, more raw. Here, the statues are smaller, often hidden among ferns and wildflowers, their features rougher but charged with a certain rustic charm. Welcome to the whimsical heart of the Roman garden, the eccentric and magical figures that some modern folks might just call garden gnomes. Of course, the Romans never had those pointy-hatted, bearded garden guardians we're used to today, but they did have their own quirky versions. Small figures called pili or pili rustici, which literally means rustic little ones. These were terracotta or stone figurines representing everything from mischievous fawns to woodland spirits and even little servants. You find one now, a squat, smiling figure clutching a bunch of grapes, its eyes twinkling with something almost human. These figures were believed to protect the garden's fertility and keep away evil spirits. Think of them as a cross between your neighborhood watchdog and that one friend who always crashes your garden party uninvited, but somehow makes it better. In a way, these tiny statues were more than just decoration. They were part of the Roman belief system, a blend of superstition, folklore, and practicality. The Romans were pragmatic, but they also believed in the power of spirits, curses, and good luck charms. A garden was a living space, but also a space where invisible forces could influence the crops, the water, and even the guests' moods. Some scholars argue that these figures were the predecessors of the modern garden gnome, while others caution against drawing a straight line from Roman terracotta to Bavarian kitsch. Historians still debate how widespread their use was. Were they common household charms or reserved for elite gardens? Either way, their presence adds a layer of playful mysticism to the otherwise serious world of Roman horticulture. Interestingly, many of these rustic figures are found near garden boundaries or entrances, threshold guardians to ward off bad luck or unwanted visitors. Imagine strolling into a senator's villa and being greeted not only by human statues, but by these tiny stone guardians, grinning knowingly from their hidden perches. And the Romans didn't stop at the humanoid. They loved animals, too, and animals in their gardens often carried symbolic meaning. Sculptures of owls, snakes, rabbits, and even mythical creatures like griffins and hippocamps, seahorses, were common. These creatures could represent wisdom, fertility, protection, or the untamed wildness beyond the cultivated garden. A curious detail appears in one statue of Satyr, a wild, goat-legged companion to Bacchus, wearing a wreath made of ivy and holding a tiny scroll. This whimsical blend of nature and culture encapsulates the Roman love of mixing the serious and the silly, the sacred and the profane. You might imagine a senator walking past these figures, perhaps secretly hoping their little stone friends would guard the prized pomegranates from pests or keep the guests amused with their odd postures. And speaking of entertainment, some of these rustic statues were known to be part of garden pranks. Yes, pranks. Romans enjoyed their practical jokes, especially in private spaces. Some scholars suggest that certain figures were placed to startle visitors, hidden behind bushes or near fountains, turning the garden into a playful, sometimes spooky maze. One example recorded in ancient texts describes a statue that would suddenly spray water when a hidden lever was triggered. It was like an ancient garden prank fountain, a water-powered joke on unsuspecting guests. The surprise and laughter that followed were apparently worth the engineering effort. If you ever wonder where the tradition of garden gnomes as guardians and pranksters began, this part of Roman gardens might hold a clue. These figures combined protection, superstition, and humor in a way that transcended mere decoration. In some villas, archaeologists have found tiny, crudely modeled figurines buried under garden beds. It's believed these were ritual offerings to ensure good harvests or to protect the home from curses. Imagine that, planting your own little stone talisman in the dirt, hoping it worked better than your neighbor's elaborate statue. Of course, this also brings up the question, Did the Romans think these little figures had actual magical powers? Or were they more like symbolic gestures, a way to impose order and control over nature's unpredictability? Historians are still unraveling this, but the combination of superstition and garden aesthetics seems undeniable. As you continue walking, you notice a tiny figure hidden among the lavender. A little fawn with a mischievous grin, its eyes glinting with mischief. It's not just a statue. It's a story, a joke, a silent companion in the stillness of night. And in a world ruled by Senate speeches and military conquests, maybe that's exactly what Roman senators needed. The unpredictable charm of a garden gnome, or its ancient cousin, to remind them that life could be lighthearted, even sacredly silly. The garden's atmosphere shifts again as you wander toward a shaded grove, where tall cypress trees create an almost cathedral-like quiet. Here, among the rustling leaves and dappled sunlight, you come upon the statues of philosophers. Not the stoic heroes of marble you saw before, but figures deeply engaged in thought, leaning on scrolls, gazing at the sky, or lost in conversation with invisible interlocutors. Roman senators loved philosophy, not just as intellectual exercise, but as a way of life. These gardens were places to ponder, debate, and occasionally escape the relentless political drama of Rome's forum. Philosophical statues symbolize wisdom and self-control, virtues every senator claimed to prize, at least in theory. You pause before a statue of Seneca, the famous Stoic philosopher and advisor to Emperor Nero, his hand raised in mid-gesture, as if caught explaining the nature of virtue. Historians still argue whether these statues were meant to inspire the viewer or simply flaunt the owner's education and cultural sophistication. Either way, their presence was a subtle reminder. No matter how powerful you are, wisdom should guide your actions. Next to Seneca is a figure holding a wax tablet, probably Cicero, who wasn't just a master orator, but also a deep thinker. His statues often show him mid-speech, mouth slightly open, eyes wide, capturing that moment just before persuasion bent the will crowd. The garden, in this sense, became a stage not only for physical performances, but also for intellectual ones. What's curious and delightfully human is that some philosopher statues aren't solemn at all. One statue of Epicurus, the founder of philosophy that prized pleasure as the highest good, reclines lazily, almost smirking. Nearby, a figure thought to be Diogenes the Cynic holds a lantern during the day, symbolizing his search for an honest man. You almost expect him to step down and start poking fun at the rest of the statues. These statues serve multiple roles: inspiration, decoration, and even subtle political messaging. After all, Rome's senators were deeply aware of how their gardens were seen by peers and clients. Displaying statues of philosophers conveyed a message of rationality and moral superiority, even if the owner's real behavior was less than stoic. There's also a fringe theory among scholars that some gardens were arranged according to philosophical schools, creating mini paths of thought, where visitors could literally walk through Stoicism, Epicureanism, or Cynicism, each turn of the path inviting reflection on different ideas about life and virtue. It's a poetic concept, if difficult to prove archaeologically. Amidst these statues, you also find carved inscriptions with famous quotes, sometimes encouraging moderation, sometimes mocking vanity. One inscription reads, "Better be silent and be thought wise and to speak and remove all doubt." Sounds like a perfect motto for a politician avoiding tough questions. But not all the statues were overtly serious. There are smaller reliefs depicting comic philosophers, those who mocked the pretensions of their peers. The Greeks loved this tradition and Romans borrowed it, placing caricatured busts that tease public figures or even themselves. A small detail catches your eye: a statue of Socrates with donkey's ears. It's a cheeky reminder that even the wisest men were subject to ridicule, and that philosophy was as much about questioning as it was about answers. In a way, these statues invite visitors to not take things too seriously, even in a garden dedicated to high ideals. And this brings us back, surprisingly, to those garden gnome-like figures from earlier sections. You realize these different garden elements: family busts, theater masks, rustic figurines, philosopher statues, were all part of a carefully curated experience that blended seriousness with playfulness, status with whimsy. The garden was a world in miniature, a space where senators balanced their public roles with private identities, and where the sacred met the silly. As you leave the grove, you hear the faint murmur of water from a nearby fountain, reminding you that Roman gardens were never just about statues. They were sensory journeys, a symphony of sight, sound, scent, and texture, all designed to soothe, inspire, and sometimes entertain. And if you listen closely, maybe you can hear the echoes of long-ago debates, laughter, and occasional prank, carried on the wind through the leaves. The soft splash of water draws you closer to a grand fountain at the garden center, a sparkling oasis surrounded by statues of gods and nymphs. Here, the line between nature and art blurs, and you realize just how much Roman senators loved to show off their wealth and sophistication through these elaborate water features. Fountains weren't just for cooling off or beautifying the space. They were statements. The sound of flowing water brought life to the garden and symbolized abundance, purity, and divine favor. A wealthy senator's fountain often had complex plumbing, with hidden pipes and mechanisms that would have seemed like ancient magic. One of the most famous fountains you might picture is from the gardens of the Emperor Augustus, featuring sculptures of dolphins and sea creatures playing in the spray. While Augustus wasn't a senator per se, senators of the late Republic and early Empire often tried to replicate or surpass such grandeur to prove their status. Historians still debate how much of the water engineering was practical versus theatrical. Some believe these fountains were designed primarily for display during grand parties and public events, rather than everyday use. Yet, the constant gurgling of water had a calming effect, masking city noise and creating a microclimate of tranquility. What's fun and slightly odd is that some fountains included hidden surprises to entertain guests, like water jets that could be triggered to spray unsuspecting visitors. Imagine strolling to the garden in your toga only to be doused unexpectedly, a perfect blend of Roman practicality and humor. You also find smaller, personal fountains, often decorated with carvings of animals associated with fertility or protection. Frogs, turtles, and even fish appear frequently, each with symbolic meanings that added layers of meaning to the garden. One especially curious example involves a fountain topped with a small statue of Priapus, the Roman god of fertility, who was often depicted with, exaggerated features meant to ward off evil and promote growth. It was part superstition, part garden decor, and part comic relief. Some of these statues had movable parts that splashed water at just the right moment, a playful reminder that nature and humor could coexist in elite spaces. Think of it as the ancient version of a garden sprinkler prank. As you linger near the fountain, you notice how the senators would have arranged seating and pathways to maximize the sensory experience. The sight of sparkling water, the sound of trickling streams, the scent of wet stone and fresh flowers, all choreographed to soothe and impress. The connection between water and power was strong. Water was precious and controlled, and the ability to bring fresh water to a villa demonstrated both engineering skill and wealth. Aqueducts fed these gardens, turning nature into a spectacle of civilization. A quirky tidbit is that some senators would compete over whose fountain could shoot water highest into the air, much like modern-day city fountains or Vegas hotel displays. This friendly rivalry could last years, with upgrades and modifications made to outdo each other. Scholars have noted that fountains also serve symbolic political roles. The controlled, flowing water mirror the ideal of a well-ordered state, governed by a wise ruler who channels the chaotic forces of nature into harmony and prosperity. One theory suggests that by showcasing their garden's water features, senators were subtly reminding visitors of their role as caretakers of Rome itself, a blend of nature, culture, and power. Of course, not all senators had such opulent gardens. Some kept their fountains simple, choosing to focus on plants and sculptures instead. But even a modest water feature carried weight in a society that prized symbolism. Walking away from the fountain, you feel the cool mist lingering on your skin and realize that Roman senators used every tool available, the visual, the tactile, the auditory, to create a perfect garden experience, one that blended status, beauty, and a touch of fun. And if you think about it, these water features weren't so different from the garden gnomes and rustic figures. They were all part of a carefully balanced mix of serious display and playful charm. The garden was a stage for life, power, and whimsy all at once.